Welcome to The Debate. For centuries, millions of people have stood up in church every Sunday and, recited the exact same 65 words. But what if the early church completely misunderstood what those words were actually for?
Right. Or conversely, what if modern believers have completely stripped this prayer of its original power?
Yeah.
By treating it like a casual, personal journaling prompt, entirely ignoring the fact that it was designed to be the ultimate unifying cry of a global community.
It is a massive tension, especially, I think, for a new believer trying to navigate their faith. On one hand, you are handed a quiet room, maybe a journal, and told to simply speak from the heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
To build an intimate, spontaneous relationship with God. But then you walk into a sanctuary, the music swells, and you find yourself swept up in a massive, synchronized recitation of ancient words.
Standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others in a deeply structured ritual.
Exactly. And nowhere is that diagnostic muddy water more pronounced than in the Lord's Prayer. So today, we are asking the central question: is the Lord's Prayer primarily a specific, fixed ritual designed for communal recitation, or is it a flexible outline like a scaffolding intended to guide spontaneous personal devotion?
And to figure this out, we are diving deep into the historical commentaries, early church documents like the first century Didache, the linguistic research of Joachim Germaeus, and modern theological perspectives on Christian mission.
Yeah, we're looking at how this text was born, how it evolved, and, what it practically demands from believers today.
And while we both deeply respect the text, we are definitely coming at its primary function from two very different angles.
I will be arguing that the Lord's Prayer is fundamentally a flexible structural guide. It's a brilliantly designed framework meant to inspire an active, spontaneous relationship with God, and ultimately to drive daily missional living.
And I'll be arguing that treating it simply as a personal outline ignores the overwhelming historical evidence. The early manuscripts and ancient church practices prove this prayer was originally a fixed, sacred ritual explicitly meant to unite the corporate body of believers.
Let's start right at the source. Looking at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, Jesus explicitly frames his prayer as an outline, not some rote incantation.
Well,
Right before he teaches it, he gives a strict warning against, quote, babbling like Gentiles, who imagine they will be heard because they just repeat a bunch of magical words over and over. He doesn't say, recite these exact syllables. He says, pray like this.
true, but pray like this doesn't necessarily mean use this as a loose brainstorm session.
It means he is offering a blueprint. The petitions he lays out, hallowing God's name, asking for provision, seeking forgiveness, requesting protection, these are categories of concern.
Okay, but
If we're looking for tips on how to use this in daily devotion, look at brilliant theologians like the Puritan Matthew Henry. He created expansive, book-length paraphrases of the Lord's Prayer.
he did, yes.
He would take a single phrase like, "Thy kingdom come," and use it as a structural guide to spend 20 minutes spontaneously praying for, local leaders, cultural renewal, personal transformation. Treating it merely as a script to be read aloud limits its power. It was given to believers as a scaffolding to build a highly personal relationship.
I hear you on the appeal of that, I really do. But that is a highly modern, highly individualized way of looking at it. The problem is, it ignores the overwhelming historical evidence of how the closest followers of Jesus actually used the text.
How so?
Well, you have to look at Joachim Jeremias, one of the foremost scholars on the original Aramaic context of Jesus' words, along with the discovery of the Didache.
And for our listeners who might not be familiar, the Didache is essentially a first-century manual for church order, right?
Exactly. It's one of the earliest Christian documents we have outside the New Testament. And the Didache explicitly commanded early believers, it says, as the Lord commanded in his gospel, thus pray ye.
Right.
But it didn't stop there. It specifically instructed them to recite it exactly 3 times a day. That is the very definition of a fixed ritual. You don't mandate a spontaneous journaling exercise 3 times a day.
But does a daily rhythm automatically negate it being a personal outline?
I think the language itself negates the personal outline theory. The prayer is intrinsically corporate. Notice that it does not say, my Father, or give me my daily bread, or forgive me my debts.
Yeah, it's plural.
Right, it relies entirely on our, us, and we. From day one, it was designed to unite diverse Christian groups worldwide in a shared, fixed liturgical act. The whole point was subsuming the individual into the corporate body of Christ. It was never meant to be just an individualized, spontaneous exercise.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Even if we lean into the our and us, that doesn't mean it has to be a rigid ritual recited in a sanctuary. I want to focus on how we use this prayer today as a missiological primer.
A primer?
Yeah, Henry French wrote a brilliant piece in Word and World where he points out that praying "Thy kingdom come" is actually a subversive act. It turns the world upside down.
Subversive how? I mean, it's a prayer for peace, isn't it?
It is, but when a believer uses this scaffolding in their personal devotion, they aren't just reciting a poem. They're committing to daily missional living. When you pray, "Give us our daily bread," and you recognize it as our bread, not my bread, it demands a personal, daily commitment to social justice.
Okay, social justice is a modern framework, though.
Sure, but the principle isn't. If it's our bread, I'm suddenly deeply concerned with my neighbor who has none while I have a pantry full. It demands the redistribution of hoarded resources. It demands the active forgiving of literal and relational debts. It's a daily ethical realignment.
Right.
And frankly, you cannot achieve that level of personal ethical transformation if you just relegate the prayer to a chanted formula you mindlessly repeat with a crowd on Sunday morning.
But viewing this merely as a personal ethical guide or, a manifesto for social justice, it severely limits its profound historical and sacramental weight.
Limits it.
Absolutely. In the ancient church, the Lord's Prayer wasn't a casual daily checklist for ethical living. It was a guarded mystery.
Guarded? You mean they kept it a secret?
Completely secret. If we look at the writings of Cyril of Jerusalem from the 4th century specifically, his mystagogical catechetical lectures, the Lord's Prayer was strictly reserved for the baptized.
Wow, really?
Yes, it was prayed during the Missa Fidelium, which was the service of the faithful, immediately before taking the Eucharist. Anyone who was unbaptized or just exploring the faith was literally dismissed from the room before these words were spoken.
That seems entirely counter to the idea of a welcoming gospel. Why hide a prayer?
Because they approached it with such trembling reverence. The early Christians were facing heavy persecution, yes, but more importantly, they viewed this prayer as an initiation into the ultimate mysteries of the faith.
Huh.
The priest actually had to preface it by saying, "We make bold to say our Father." It was considered dangerously intimate. It was a profound communal privilege, not a flexible framework for morning journaling.
Well, if we are talking about intimacy, let's look at the actual language Jesus chose. If the prayer is just a rigid, guarded ritual, isn't that like handing someone a strict script for a marriage proposal instead of teaching them how to communicate with their spouse?
I don't think that's a fair comparison.
I think it is. Think of the scaffolding less like a rigid script for a play and more like the agenda for a crucial board meeting. Jesus is giving us the 5 bullet points we absolutely must cover: provision, forgiveness, protection. But he expects us to bring our own specific department updates to the table. And he signals this right at the beginning by introducing the Aramaic word Abba.
The word for father.
Right, but it's deeper than just father. It translates more closely to dear father or papa. Jesus introduced the intimate Aramaic word Abba to break down rigid walls, not build new liturgical ones.
Okay, but
The Talmud notes that Abba is the first word a weaning child learns to stammer. No Jewish person of that era would have dared address the Almighty with such secular, familial intimacy. By authorizing his disciples to use Abba, Jesus was inviting them into a dynamic, spontaneous family relationship. You don't script a child's conversation with their father. You teach them the language of love and let them speak.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
The invocation of Abba is indeed intimate, I'll give you that. But moving from that beautiful intimacy to the conclusion that the text itself was meant to be altered or improvised,
It ignores the manuscript evidence of how the text evolved. If this was just an agenda for a board meeting, as you say, why did the early church lock down the exact wording so strictly?
But they didn't lock it down. That's exactly my point.
What do you mean?
If we are going to look closely at the earliest manuscripts, the textual evolution actually proves the text did evolve and adapt. If it was meant to be an unchangeable, rigid incantation, the early church would never have dared to alter it. Yet, when we look at the Gospel of Luke, his version is much shorter. It only has 5 petitions. Matthew's version has 7.
Yes, there are differences between the Gospels.
Major differences in the Greek. Luke says, "Give us each day our daily bread," using a present imperative verb.
Right.
And for those whose ancient Greek is a little rusty, a present imperative means it's a continuous, ongoing habit. But Matthew says, "Give us this day our daily bread," using an aorist imperative, meaning a one-time, urgent request for right now.
Okay, the verb tenses differ.
Furthermore, Luke uses the word sins, while Matthew uses debts. The early church clearly adapted the outline over time to fit different pastoral contexts. They recognized that the essence of the prayer was its thematic structure, not a magical sequence of syllables.
But you were assuming those variations were the result of individual believers just casually improvising. Biblical scholars point out that the differences between Matthew and Luke don't represent individual freedom.
Then what do they represent?
They represent 2 different established liturgical wordings from 2 distinct communities. Matthew is transmitting the instruction on prayer directed at Jewish Christians. They were accustomed to the rich, sonorous parallelisms of the synagogue. Luke is transmitting the catechism used for Gentile Christians who had a different cultural context. These aren't examples of an individual sitting in a room paraphrasing the prayer. These are 2 distinct fixed liturgies of the early church.
But what about the ending, the doxology?
You mean, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever"?
Exactly. That famous ending is completely absent from the earliest Greek manuscripts, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. I mean, those are the absolute oldest physical Greek Bibles we have ever dug out of the ground.
That is true.
It isn't in the early Latin Vulgate either, which was the standard Latin translation everyone used for 1,000 years. It was added much later. Doesn't that prove the church treated it as a flexible living document?
Actually, it proves the exact opposite.
How so?
The doxology wasn't added because individuals were spontaneously expanding their personal devotions. It was an institutional hymnic addition reflecting Jewish synagogue responses, specifically the Kaddish.
Oh, the Kaddish.
Right. It was explicitly added to facilitate communal, ritual worship. The fact that the Didache standardizes the Matthean version with the doxology so early on proves that the church sought to unify diverse Christian groups during corporate worship through a single shared recitation.
Okay, well, if we are going to follow that thread of translation and look closely at the exact words the early church standardized, we have to talk about what those specific words actually meant to the people saying them.
Definitely.
Because how we translate these concepts deeply impacts how modern believers use the prayer today.
I agree entirely. The translation fundamentally changes the application.
Let's take "Give us this day our daily bread." If I am a new believer using this as an outline, I view this as a highly practical exercise in daily devotion. It is a grounding mechanism.
Grounding?
Yeah, we are asking the Creator to provide our basic, physical needs for the next 24 hours. In a modern world plagued by anxieties about money, inflation, shrinking resources, this petition is a psychological and spiritual cure. It forces us into a posture of daily reliance on God. It reminds me that I don't need a 10-year financial plan to be secure. I just need enough for today.
That is a beautiful sentiment. It really is. But translating those terms as merely practical, daily concerns is a massive individualized reduction of what those words actually meant to the early church.
How is asking for daily bread a reduction?
Let's look at the manuscript evidence for the word daily. The Greek word used is episusios. It is a word so exceedingly rare it appears almost nowhere else in ancient Greek literature. Translators have agonized over it for centuries.
Right, it's a famous linguistic puzzle.
Exactly. But Jerome, the great translator of the Vulgate, discovered in the ancient Aramaic Gospel of the Nazarenes that the word originally used by Jesus' followers was mahar.
Mahar? What does that mean?
Mahar means tomorrow. So the literal translation is bread for tomorrow.
Wait, hold on. Tomorrow? So when they were saying daily bread, they literally weren't asking for lunch today? They were asking for tomorrow's meals?
Well, not exactly tomorrow's physical meals. You have to understand the psychology of the early church. They were deeply eschatological.
Oh, right, the end times.
Exactly. They were obsessed with the end of the world, facing intense persecution, and longing for the final arrival of God's kingdom. In the language of first-century Judaism, tomorrow meant the great tomorrow, the final consummation of history, the messianic banquet.
Wow.
They weren't just asking for a literal loaf of wheat bread to cure their financial anxieties. They were asking for the eschatological bread of life. They were asking to experience the future heavenly banquet right now.
Which honestly makes it all the more profound as a daily devotion.
How so?
Because if I am praying for the bread of tomorrow, the reality of God's perfect justice, peace, and provision to arrive today, I am pulling the reality of heaven into my mundane Tuesday morning.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right? It fundamentally alters how I treat my neighbor today. If I believe the great tomorrow is one of infinite abundance, I stop hoarding my resources right now.
Yes, but it is an apocalyptic communal reality they were invoking, not just a personal comfort. And we see this exact same apocalyptic weight in the word temptation. Lead us not into temptation. The Greek word is perismos. It doesn't just mean daily ethical slip-ups, like losing your temper in traffic or being tempted to lie on a tax return.
Are you saying perismos is also eschatological?
Absolutely. In the context of early Christian literature, perismos refers to the great testing, the final tribulation, the mass apostasy brought on by the Antichrist.
Seriously?
Yes. The early Christians were praying an apocalyptic communal ritual, pleading with God to spare the church from the final kingdom of evil. And this apocalyptic reality was best realized in their minds in the corporate Eucharist. That is where the bread of tomorrow is literally shared among the physical gathering of believers, not just internalized in solitary morning devotions.
I appreciate the depth of that historical context. And I'll admit, it certainly elevates the stakes of the prayer far beyond a simple checklist.
It really does.
But I would argue that bringing the eschatological weight of the kingdom into the present is exactly why it functions so beautifully as a flexible missional outline.
Why is that?
I'm praying to be spared from the great testing and the kingdom of evil. It makes me highly vigilant against the systemic evils of my current society. It forces me to ask, where is the kingdom of evil operating in my city today, and how can I fight it?
But the power to fight it comes from the unified voice of the church, not a fragmented collection of individuals.
Well, to summarize my view, I believe the Lord's Prayer, while possessing a rich corporate history, is fundamentally a subversive, flexible framework. It is a missiological primer, meant to guide the believer's daily relationship with God and their active mission in the world. It teaches us what to care about: God's holiness, His kingdom, our communal provision, grace, and protection. By giving us these categories, Jesus empowers us to speak to our Abba Father authentically about how those massive concepts intersect with our own specific lives.
And to summarize my perspective, the overwhelming historical evidence, from the rigid instructions of the Didache to the evolution of the early manuscripts, points to a deeply unified, sacred communal ritual.
Right.
It is not just an outline. It is a fixed liturgical anchor that binds the global church together in an eschatological reality. When we recite it, we are not just speaking our own minds. We are joining our voices with Christians across 20 centuries. We are participating in a guarded, holy mystery that transcends our individual lives and connects us to the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom.
You know, we are probably never going to agree on the exact mechanics of how this was spoken in a first-century bedroom versus a fourth-century basilica.
No, probably not.
But despite our differing lenses, there is a profound convergence here. Whether a believer uses the Lord's Prayer as a rigid corporate liturgy in a massive cathedral, or as a spontaneous personal outline in their quiet room, the prayer inherently rejects extreme individualism.
That is undeniably true.
It absolutely refuses to let us pray, "My Father." It always demands we say, "Our Father." We are forced to ask for our bread and the forgiveness of our debts. It forever links our spiritual lives to the lives of the people sitting next to us and the people suffering across the globe.
And I will concede this to you regardless of whether one views it primarily as a personal ethical framework for daily mission or an apocalyptic liturgical cry for the end of days. It stands as a definitive rebellion against the current state of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Every time it is prayed, whether spoken softly in a journal entry or chanted by a congregation of thousands, it asserts that the suffering and injustice of today is not the final reality. It is a defiant claim against the kingdom of evil that God's kingdom is coming.
So to our listeners, especially those of you who are new believers trying to map out your own spiritual journey, we suggest there is so much more to explore in this material. Let the rich historical context of the prayer inform your own daily devotion. Let the weight of words like daily bread and temptation challenge how you live out your mission.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to dig into the history of the words yourself. Let the ancient communal roots of the faith deepen your understanding, whether you find yourself primarily drawn to the quiet intimacy of relationship or the profound, historic unity of ritual.
So, next time you are handed a map to prayer, whether it directs you to a journal in a quiet room or to the soaring echoes of an ancient sanctuary, remember that the framework Jesus gave us is vast enough and powerful enough to fill both spaces. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.